everybody. So I'm Paul Kengor, Senior Director of the Institute for Faith and Freedom. It's great to be here to give this introduction to the President and Vice President. Not President Trump. I mean, you guys would love to see that right now, right? With these two. So I'm going to read you a little bit, introduce President Paul McNulty of Grove City College, and then he will come out and introduce Vice President Pence. So the Honorable Paul J. McNulty, class of 1980, Grove City College, is the 9th president of Grove City College. Prior to returning to his alma mater, McNulty spent over 30 years in Washington, D.C. as an attorney in public service and private service. In 2006, the U.S. Senate unanimously confirmed McNulty to the position of Deputy Attorney General. I don't think you can find anybody in the last 15 years has been unanimously confirmed by the Senate for anything, all right? So that right there is really impressive, which made him the second in command at the U.S. Department of Justice and the chief operating officer of the department's 100,000 employees. He also served from 2001 to 2005 as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia and was a leader in our nation's response to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. So he had a very crucial role in what happened after September 11th. In fact, gave a talk at our Rivers Club event in Pittsburgh on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. You could find that online. I strongly advise you checking it out. McNulty worked for more than 10 years as a senior attorney in the U.S. Congress. That included the Clinton impeachment years, including as chief counsel and director of legislative operations for the House Majority Leader and chief counsel for the House Subcommittee on Crime. From 2007 to 2014, McNulty led the global corporate compliance and investigations practice for Baker McKenzie, which is one of the world's largest, most prestigious law firms. McNulty received Grove City College's Alumni Achievement Award in 1998, an honorary doctorate in 2007, and from 2004 to 2014, he served on the college's board of trustees. And it was then at that point that he became president of Grove City College, succeeding Dick Jewell in 2014. McNulty met his wife, Brenda, also class of 1980, at Grove City College. That happens here. Our students find love and their future spouses here all the time. They have been blessed with 4 children and 5 grandchildren. And in fact, Brenda told me that the next grandchild is on the way soon. So we could add that here pretty soon. So here is Paul McNulty.
Thank you, Paul. Well, good morning, everyone. What a special day at Grove City College. And before I have the honor of introducing our former vice president, I want to share with you some very exciting news. The appropriate role of faith in the public square is a major issue in contemporary American life. Our founding generation envisioned a country with freedom sustained by public virtue and robust religious belief. And the presence of Judeo-Christian values in the public square, once common, expected, and welcome, is facing an alarming level of scrutiny and opposition. The forces of secularism, similar to the forces of antisemitism, see an opportunity and are on the attack. And therefore, to meet this historic moment, I am pleased to announce that Grove City College has established a new Center for Faith and Public Life, and that Vice President Mike Pence will serve as the center's Distinguished Visiting Fellow for Faith and Public Life. The center will operate under the auspices of the Institute for Faith and Freedom, and our mission will be to explore and strengthen Christian engagement in public institutions. In particular, we will champion the wise and winsome integration of Christian faith in the public square. The center is a natural extension of Grove City College's grounding in permanent ideas and conservative values. and our longstanding commitment to preserving and promoting the intellectual foundations of a free society for the advancement of the common good. The center is also directly connected to our mission to prepare young people for lives of Christian service and civic responsibility. And I can think of no one more qualified to address these issues than our former vice president, who has been a consistent and courageous example of what it looks like to serve with Christian faithfulness in public office. In the months ahead, the center will advance its mission through writings, seminars, and other programs. In addition, the vice president and I will team teach a class on faith and public service next fall. So students, look for more details on this opportunity very shortly. It'll be a one-credit class, so don't panic. You'll be able to squeeze it in if you're interested. We're looking forward to having the vice president on campus multiple times in the fall to be involved in those classes and other opportunities. Support for this initiative through your prayers and giving will be deeply appreciated. As I said, there are many forces hard at work to push Christians out of the public square. They wrongly believe, in contrast to the framers of our Constitution, that religion has no place in public life and that secularization is sufficient for America's prosperity. And we will push back on that and those ideas. We'll strive to advance thoughtful presence of Christianity in public life, which has historically and unquestionably served the good of civil society. Well, and now it's my great privilege to introduce to you the former Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence. Well, hold on. There's a little introduction to follow. I didn't want to get our flow mixed up here. I know, actually, he really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Mr. Pence is the product of a liberal arts education. He graduated from Hanover College in Indiana with a degree in history. He then earned a law degree from Indiana University School of Law, and following law school, he practiced law and led the Indiana Policy Review Foundation, hosted a radio and television program. In 2000, he was elected to Congress, and he was subsequently reelected 5 times. On Capitol Hill, he established himself as a champion of limited government, fiscal responsibility, economic development, educational opportunity, and the U.S. Constitution. His colleagues quickly recognized his leadership ability and unanimously elected him to serve as chairman of the House Republican Study Committee, and then chairman as the House Republican Conference, and he was the co-founder of the Antisemitism caucus years ago with one of the leading Democrats in the House. Well, in 2013, Vice President Pence left the nation's capital, where Hoosiers elected him the 50th governor of Indiana. He brought the same limited government and low tax philosophy to the Indiana State House. As governor, he enacted the largest income tax in Indiana, cut in Indiana history. Important word, cut, to not miss in that summary. And the state's unemployment rate fell by half during his 4 years in office. At the end of his term, more Hoosiers were working than at any other point in the state's 200-year history. He worked with members of the Indiana General Assembly to pass 2 honestly balanced budgets and left the state with strong reserves and a AAA credit ratings that were the envy of the nation. So with this record of accomplishment, it's no surprise that former President Donald Trump asked then Governor Pence to join him on the successful Republican ticket for President and Vice President of the United States. And the Trump-Pence administration built an impressive record of important accomplishments, including securing the southern border. Among the Vice President's current endeavors is the founding of the new advocacy organization called Advancing American Freedom. And you'll be hearing a lot more about AAF in the days ahead. It will be promoting and defending a genuinely conservative agenda, a freedom agenda for the country. And of course, no introduction of Mike Pence would be complete without mentioning his family, especially the love of his life and a woman deeply admired across America, Karen Pence. And the Pences are blessed with 3 children and 3 grandchildren, so they got a lot of work to do to catch up with the McNultys, but they're getting started. So please join me in a warm Grove City College welcome for Vice President Michael Pence.
Thank you so much to President McNulty. Thank you for your friendship. And congratulations on 10 years of extraordinary leadership at Grove City College. We just admire you so much. I appreciated that introduction. He read it just the way I wrote it. But Paul McNulty himself served this country in so many ways, not only helping to build this extraordinary institution alongside his wonderful wife Brenda, but also serving as Deputy Attorney General of the United States with great distinction. But perhaps his most important contribution, I am told by Grovers, is bringing Chick-fil-A onto campus, and I want to congratulate you for that. But it's good to be back. It's good to be back on the campus of Grove City. And also, let me just say to President McNulty, to Paul Kengor, to the whole team, it is going to be my great honor to be a visiting fellow at the new Center for Faith and Public Life. We're so looking forward to being a part of this campus. The Bible says iron sharpens iron, and I can't wait to be able to sit among the men and women who are that young iron on this campus. Grove City has such an extraordinary legacy, training young men and women of integrity to be those beacons of light and faith in a world so needful of it. And so I want to thank you, President McNulty, and members of the board for the great honor of being able to be a small part of the mission of this extraordinary institution. We're gathering today on a topic of enormous importance and at a very challenging time in the life of our nation, in the life of the Jewish people, and in the life of our most cherished ally, Israel. 7 October 2023, Israel was the target of the worst terrorist attack since 9/11. The worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It was an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign and peaceful nation. More than 1,400 men, women, and infant children lost their lives that day. Thousands more were injured, and more than 200 were taken hostage, many of whom have been confirmed lost forever. As Israel has waged its justified war against the terrorists of Hamas, inexplicably, we've also seen a rise in anti-Israel and even openly anti-Semitic rhetoric across this country and around the world. And so join me in thanking the leadership and the faculty here at Grove City College for gathering to speak about this urgent issue at such a time as this. Thank you. But first, what happened? I traveled to Israel the first week of this year simply to show support that I believe represents the overwhelming majority of the heart of the American people. for the people of Israel. I traveled to the city of Sderot that my wife and I had visited, a community in southern Israel that was beset by that invasion. And the police station taken over and innocent civilians killed in the streets. We stopped by the field where so many young people lost their lives at a music concert, and we visited a kibbutz known as Kfar Aza, a small kibbutz, literally within eyesight of the fence line of Gaza, that was decimated by the Hamas terrorists. You know, in my various roles as a governor and as vice president, I've visited places that endured great hardship, hurricanes and wildfires, tornadoes, and even disasters inflicted by violence. I never saw anything like this. I've been to war zones where you see the aftermath of war. This was not the aftermath of war. This was the aftermath of evil. I spoke to a father who literally saved his family in that kibbutz by holding the bomb shelter door shut with his own hands while his young family cowered in the corner and the terrorists tried to break in. And then saw him say with tears in his eyes how the elderly neighbors who had similar shelters in their homes simply didn't have the strength to hold the door shut and were slaughtered. I spoke to a mother outside the home where she said she last spoke to her daughter by phone. And she reported seeing the terrorists make their way down the street, make their way into the home, and she heard on the phone as her daughter was kidnapped, still missing to this day. But to walk into those homes, literally bullet-riddled, the furniture and the floor is still stained by blood, and to hear the stories of the atrocities that took place. I must tell you, I never felt a greater combination of grief and anger in my entire life. Grief at those that had suffered so much that day, but anger. For what I learned was two things that may not be as obvious to people. First off, this was not simply a terrorist attack. This was a terrorist invasion, highly organized. The Hamas terrorists breached the fence at 90 different locations simultaneously and then moved into southern Israel in 3 different waves, heavily armed on motorized vehicles, with one objective, and that was to kill Jews. I mean, but for the heroism of law enforcement and many civilians and ultimately IDF forces, they literally had brought sufficient arms to cut Israel in half, to march all the way to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It was extraordinary. The other thing that I learned was the sheer brutality of it. The communities that I was visiting were to that day the communities in Israel that were most supportive of the Palestinian people. By all accounts, they were people that championed the hope for a Palestinian state. They were people that worked to expand work visas traveling out of Gaza and the West Bank to work in Israel. It was an elderly gentleman in that kibbutz who looked at me and he said, "We've always been for them and for their well-being. They knew who we were, and they still came to kill us." It was sheer mendacity. And let me be clear on this point. There is no moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas. If the Palestinians laid down their weapons right now and released all the hostages, we'd have peace. If Israel laid down all of its weapons, we'd have no Israel. That's why I believe we must continue to stand with Israel as she does whatever it takes to hunt down and destroy Hamas once and for all. If the world knows nothing else, the world should know this: America stands with Israel. If you look back in history, no one second-guessed America's use of overwhelming force after Japanese Zeros made their way to Pearl Harbor. No one questioned the use of force during my early days in Congress when the towers fell. In New York City, the Pentagon was struck, and here in Pennsylvania, in a field not far from here, the heroes of the first battle in the War on Terror lost their lives. The world supported our efforts because they knew about the threat to our nation, and so the world must stand with Israel in this moment. Unfortunately, I would say we live at a time when there are elements of both political parties that are beginning to retreat from our historic alliances in the world and even begin to question our support for Israel. And at such a time as this, it's deeply concerning to those of us who understand the stakes. In the Democratic Party, we've seen President Biden kowtowing to left-wing public opinion, talking about a two-state solution in this environment, which couldn't be the worst possible timing to talk about concessions. And just this week, the president actually called again for a ceasefire without demanding that hostages be released before it takes place. And in all fairness, even among Republicans, there's a rising tide of isolationism. Some voices inside and outside our party that even question support for Israel in these difficult days. But let me say, whatever the position of the current administration or voices in the Republican Party take, Israel has no choice but to fight to the end and win and defeat Hamas. And I know the American people are with them. That was my message. But as we gather today, I know you do so knowing that supporting Israel requires more than just supporting their action overseas and demanding that our leaders provision them with the resources that they need to defend their nation and end the threat of Hamas terrorists. But it also requires strong moral action here at home. And that's where the leadership of Grove City College in this moment, hosting a conference on anti-Semitism, is so vitally important. Because it grieves me to say we do gather at a time of a rising tide of anti-Semitism in this country. On campuses across the country, you know the stories. It was just recently that 9 Jewish students from prominent universities testified before the Congress about feeling unsafe on their campuses and put upon. We all remember the recent testimony that took place in December. Presidents of MIT and Harvard and even here in Penn came forward and couldn't bring themselves in 2 cases to say that those that advocate genocide against the Jewish people are acting in a way unacceptable on the campus. Unfortunately, 2 of those campuses made a dramatic change. But it's not just been on campuses around America that we've seen this intolerance and anti-Semitism. I was struck by a news story I came across just the other day of a 89-year-old Holocaust survivor who was speaking at a Berkeley, California city council meeting on behalf of a Holocaust remembrance. And then she made the statement about remembering those that had suffered so grievously on October the 7th. And she was shouted down at that meeting with the worst form of rancorous anti-Semitism to a Holocaust survivor. You know, anti-Semitism often masquerades as criticism of Israel. And the truth is, we've seen anti-Semitic rhetoric on our campuses and at rallies openly supporting Hamas. And maybe I just have more faith in the American people than some. I just can't believe that the overwhelming majority of those young people know what they're actually defending. And again, that's why this conference is so important. Because I believe in my heart in the goodness of the majority of the American people. I can't imagine that people would be waving flags and defending Hamas if they knew a fraction of what happened that day. But it's not just on college campuses around the country and in city hall meetings. We all know it's anti-Semitic rhetoric has even made its way into the hall of Congress. We've heard members of Congress that have engaged in anti-Semitic tropes. But in all fairness, even on the right, just this last week, one of the most prominent media voices on the right actually interviewed a Palestinian pastor who had applauded the attack on October the 7th and spoke about the strength of the Palestinians. And that commentator actually questioned and ridiculed Christians for having lost their thread if they could still stand with the people of Israel in the midst of the fighting. We gathered today perhaps for no other reason than to make it clear. There is no place for anti-Semitism in any form, in any place in the United States of America. And it's not simply a wrongness of morality and history and alliances. Anti-Semitism is dangerous. I hardly need to tell people in Pennsylvania about a day in October of 2018. Not far from here, the Tree of Life Synagogue, where the hatred of anti-Semitism, the evil, motivated a perpetrator to take the lives of 11 people, wounding 6, including several Holocaust survivors that very day, in the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the history of the United States. I visited a synagogue in California that had also been beset by a gunman. Walked into Shabbat services and opened fire only to be turned aside by heroes. I mean, this is a moment where we have to recognize what the stakes are, and we have to stand firm and stand strong. Throughout my career, I'm humbled that President McNulty reflected on the fact that this is not a new issue for me. You know, I'm a Bible-believing Christian, and I've long believed in those ancient words about the people of Israel, that those who bless her will be blessed, those who curse her will be cursed. And the American people have cherished that principle since the founding of our nation, and so do I. In my time in the Congress of the United States, it was one of the greatest moments of my career when the only Holocaust survivor ever to be elected to Congress, the late Tom Lantos, and his wife Annette came to my office. Now, Tom Lantos was about as liberal as I am conservative. California Democrat. And I was an evangelical Christian who was chairman of the House Conservative Caucus at the time. And he walked in, and I looked at him with the deepest respect and said, "What are you doing here?" But he knew my love for Israel. And he told me that Parliament had created an anti-Semitism caucus overseas. He said the time had come for one in the Congress. It was my great honor, along with the late Tom Lantos, to found the first anti-Semitism caucus in the Congress of the United States. And there was broad bipartisan support for that work. When I became governor of Indiana, we signed one of the toughest anti-BDS bills that would be passed in the United States. And I will tell you, I couldn't be more proud to have been vice president in the most pro-Israel administration in American history. We took decisive steps moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan Heights, but we also here at home, we signed an executive order that denied any federal funding whatsoever to any university that countenanced anti-Semitism on its campuses. We stood strong. And that's what we need to do as I close in this moment. I hope we didn't just come here to talk about anti-Semitism. I hope you leave here today, hundreds of students who are here and the wonderful citizens that have gathered, with a burden on your heart to do something, a call to action. Maybe it's just to tell the story of what you may learn more about today, about what happened that day. Maybe it's to understand the stakes and the risks that anti-Semitism poses, not just to the Jewish people, but to the life of our nation. But we must do more. I would submit to you that 4 steps we ought to consider, each and every one of us. Number 1, seize every opportunity to condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms. Speak out. Be that salt and that light, calling people to account. Secondly, we must make it clear that there is zero tolerance for acts of violence in this country motivated by enmity toward the Jewish people. Third, we must make it clear that rhetoric that calls for the end of the Jewish state or the genocide of the Jewish people is anti-Semitism and has no place in the United States of America. And finally, as Indiana began to do this year, I think the time has come for states across the country, even here in Pennsylvania, to enact legislation that defines anti-Semitism and prohibits anti-Semitic rhetoric in our public schools and in our universities. These are among steps that we can take, but they can show our commitment to justice. They can show our commitment to our Jewish neighbors and friends. And I believe it's incumbent on each and every one of us to take ownership of this great challenge. You know, America stands with Israel today at a critical moment in the life of our relationship. We stand with Israel for the same reason the American people have always stood with Israel. Because her cause is our cause. Her values are our values. Her fight is our fight. We stand with Israel because we believe in right over wrong and good over evil. And we stand with Israel because Israel's very existence is proof that the promises of God are true. This sentiment is not new. It was captured first and maybe most eloquently on 18 August, 1790, in a letter that George Washington wrote to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. But I believe it expresses the sentiment and the aspiration of the American people. The congregation had written to him speaking favorably about his administration, and he took the opportunity to write back and express his appreciation. But then he said these words that echo through history and are worth repeating today. You know, the Bible says, pay more careful attention to what you've already learned. And this might be a time for us to remind our neighbors and friends of these ancient principles in America. George Washington wrote, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that those who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." And then he said his hope and his prayer. George Washington, a devout Christian man, said, quote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. And may the Father of all mercies gather light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. That's the American sentiment. That's the sentiment that proceeds from our faith and our common Judeo-Christian heritage. And let us in this moment, each one of us, resolve to be a voice for that sentiment, to stand against the evil of anti-Semitism, to stand with our most cherished ally, Israel, to reject anti-Semitism in all its form, and to do our part to create a more perfect union. So help us God.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, and the sincerity of them is just so strong given the long record you've had in supporting both Israel, but more importantly, even opposing anti-Semitism. As that story about the caucus is so great. You know, I want to take just a moment. You expressed, it was very striking for you to describe how this struck you, this horror, in relation to all the things you've seen, people you've met, the Gold Star families, the disasters of one sort or another. That's kind of an amazing thing to think about when you think about all the things that in your service that you've been around. And you just touched on the wickedness that you saw, right? And the targeting of infants and so forth. And could you say just a little bit more about a couple of things that may have struck you, especially in that?
Before I traveled to Israel, the embassy came to my Washington office and brought the film that had been gathered from the body cameras of terrorists, as well as home ring cameras. And I watched every bit, as much of it as I could. It's why I said, Paul, I tend to assume the best of people always. When I see young people out at rallies waving Palestinian flags, they have every right to be involved in that debate. Not now. Not when you're actually standing and defending a terrorist organization that is equal to ISIS, literally equal to Al-Qaeda, and in some ways worse. Two anecdotes of that day that I didn't mention. One was we were literally in the kibbutz where much of the video that we saw had been captured. But to be literally walking on the site and recognizing from the film things that had happened, there was a cold, it wasn't that the perpetrators were acting in anger, swept up in violence. It's that they were cold, calculating, and remorseless. Literally walking through rooms, opening fire on women, children. There was a scene where a terrorist killed a father in front of his two boys that looked to be about 12 and 10 years old. And the boys were injured somehow. I think he threw a hand grenade in I think he threw a hand grenade in the bomb shelter before he went in and shot their father. And the two boys ran into the kitchen, one bleeding from his forehead. They were both weeping, and the two terrorists walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and just started talking about looking for something to drink while the boys sat there weeping, not knowing whether they'd live or die. And then talking to a father just about the beautiful young couple that literally had been murdered in the home that he walked me through, told me where their remains had been found. The stories about, as I said, I've been to the aftermath of war. My father saw combat. My son is a Marine. So I didn't wear the uniform, but I've been to the aftermath in various roles. This was not the aftermath of war. This was the aftermath of evil. Not only did they murder people, but they brought provisions to wire people together and set them on fire. I mean, the violence that was perpetrated against the Jewish people was absolutely unspeakable. Yeah. And that's why I said I never had a greater combination of grief and anger in that moment. But I will tell you one other thing that's on the other side of that. The next day, we went to the northern border and visited an artillery battery with Israeli Defense Forces right on the border of Lebanon, where the shelling was taking place. And I as heartsick as I was about the day before, my heart swelled with what I saw that day, because I learned that the 30,000 soldiers that deployed to the northern border on October the 7th, 90% were reservists, Paul. And they deployed in 12 hours to the northern border, and most of them told me, we didn't have any orders. We just grabbed our gear, got in our cars, and drove. We knew where our area of responsibility would be. And it was deeply inspiring. And I have to believe in my heart of hearts that they moved so swiftly to secure the southern border that they likely prevented Hezbollah from being emboldened to move across the border. I don't know that, but I have to believe it played a key role. But it was so inspiring, and the unity in that country. I met with leaders of all different perspectives, and I don't play in Israeli politics. I don't do that. I meet with all different sides. But the unity there and the resolve there, I think, is a consequence of the character of their people and, frankly, the prayers of the American people.
And you've seen over the many years that the sort of mindset of always being threatened, always being at risk, right? They live with that every day. Let's take this to our home shore a little bit. Last Friday was the International Day of Al-Quds, which is an annual pro-Palestinian event. In a Dearborn, Michigan rally, there were shouts of death to Israel and death to America. And the rally was led by a man named Tarek Bazzi, who has apparently called for the annihilation of Jews, the extinction. And according to the Detroit News, Bazzi said that U.S. support for Israel means that, quote, it does not deserve to exist on God's earth. So in addition to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, backed by Iran, Hezbollah's threat, talk about the threat that Islamist extremists pose to Americans here and abroad, especially involving the Iranian-supported groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah.
I think we're living in a very perilous time right now, and it requires vigilance by law enforcement at every level. I was appalled to hear chants of death to America taking place at a rally in Michigan. Just, and I think, frankly, it dishonored the Muslim community that calls that community home. But the reality is that under this administration, we essentially have had an open borders policy. Nearly 10 million people have come across our border. And while we think of illegal immigration as people coming from Central and South America, the truth is that there are people, there's literally a category, you remember from your days in the Justice Department, they call it OTM, other than Mexico, which seems to be an antiseptic way of when people come from the Middle East, or people come from Africa, or people come from countries that tend to harbor a high percentage of people that are hostile to our way of life. And there have literally been thousands of people interdicted at the border, and so we must assume that there's literally thousands of people that have come into the country. So I think this is a time of extraordinary, the need for extraordinary vigilance. I'm confident that law enforcement at the state and federal level is about that. I would expect nothing less, but you know, Paul, you and I first met in the aftermath of 9/11. I was on Capitol Hill on September the 11th. I went across the river to the Pentagon the next day. A week later, I traveled to Ground Zero. And traveling home with our young children, a few months later, we made our way to Shanksville. It's wanted my kids to see it. The only thing that was there was a plywood wall with handwritten names. People had placed flowers, and there was a little white cross at the impact site. And so I have no illusions about the people who did harm to our country and would choose to do harm again. And it's one of the reasons why in this moment we have to stand so firmly with Israel, because I heard this again from Prime Minister Netanyahu, from the Deputy Prime Minister Benny Gantz and others. They said, you know, they said, it just starts here. It starts here. But if the terrorists are able to achieve their aims there, we've already seen American lives lost in the region. We know about Iran's intentions. And I would submit to you that the only way to ensure peace and security of the United States and Israel is by standing strong against the terrorist element there and being prepared to stand strong against them here.
Yeah. And it's very concerning, isn't it, that this pressure against Israel since its response to the horrors of October 7th are increasingly isolating Israel. So as you say, we're its oldest friend, but it's losing friends. And it's very concerning, isn't it, to think about where that puts it in terms of its ability to be a moral force and to be effective as the only democracy in the region that represents, you know, Western interests and American concerns to fight terrorism, but it's being isolated, and we can only hope that they'll be able to regain that stature that they had worked so hard to develop.
Right.
You know, you talked about 9/11, and those of us who were involved in the post 9/11 time frame, you know, my office met with literally thousands of victims of 9/11 as we prosecuted the cases and dealt with, you know, just the horrors of the day and the need to remember. Do you find it perplexing, bewildering? You're such a positive person, that the Holocaust wasn't the last word, that it didn't serve to continue to remind us of the horrors of anti-Semitism? You and I grew up in the same time frame, and you know, we were taught that Hitler was a monster and that what happened there was horrifying and that, you know, it could never happen again. You know, I think we accepted that as being absolutely fundamental to our worldview.
Right.
And it does feel like that sense of that memory has slipped to the point where you can mock a Holocaust survivor.
Well, that story, I had to mention it. It just horrified me when I read an 89-year-old woman mocked and ridiculed as a Jew who had survived the Holocaust, just simply for having mentioned the atrocities of October the 7th. But look, I'd say two things. Number one, I had a lunch at a folding table at this artillery battery on the northern border in Israel. And a soldier across the table looked at me and he said, I was driving north, and my grandfather, who also survived the Holocaust, he said, my grandfather called me and said, I told you so. And I looked at him across the table and I said, you know, I think I know what your grandfather meant, but can you tell me what you think he meant? And he said, I know exactly what he meant. He said, my whole life he's told me this could happen again. And that was one of my biggest takeaways from my visit over there was this. We think of terrorist attacks, right? We tend to think of them as one-off events. But this was rightly understood. It was an invasion. This was, again, I'll give you the statistic. I learned it when I was in Sderot. 90 different simultaneous incursions of the fence line from Gaza into Israel at the same time. On Saturday morning, which is Shabbat, which is a time of rest and refreshment for observant Jews and all of Israel. And they came in heavily armed in 3 different waves. It literally was an invasion. And it was literally designed to annihilate the Jewish state.
I think you told me that a lot of those on the attack had gathered intelligence over a long period of time about specific families. Yes. As they served and worked with them. As they were being served by those families, they were gathering intelligence on who they would attack.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The mayor of Kfar Aza, the kibbutz I visited, was building a park where Jews and Palestinians could bring their families together to celebrate unity in between the border of Gaza and the kibbutz. He was known to be a great champion. I learned that day that they went to his house first and found him and killed him in front of his home. That's the level of evil we're talking about here. And the only answer to that you could never expect someone to settle their differences with a serial killer living next door. You're not going to settle it. They just have to hunt down and destroy Hamas once and for all. And I would say to you, I think that it's incumbent on us. Karen and I like to open the Bible and read and pray every morning. And we were reading this morning about when the people of Israel, after Moses died, people of Israel crossed the Jordan. And the water stopped. It's convenient. But then what's interesting is then the Lord tells Joshua, go to the middle of the river and gather stones from the middle of the river. And I grew up by a creek, and you can tell when you got creek stones. And he said, take them out and stack them outside the river so the people will remember this was where God was faithful. And I think that maybe I should have added that to my admonitions, and I will in the future. Maybe each one of us, part of what we have to do right now is make sure that we're educating young people like you do so well here at Grove City College about what has gone before. And not just the Holocaust, but to understand that the Jewish people are the only people on earth who have been subject to multiple efforts at genocide against them as a people. They hold that unique distinction, and to not accept the fact that the same evil that was afoot against the Jewish people thousands of years ago is not still afoot, is not to pay attention to other aspects of that book. Karen and I were reading. And so I think it's important, it's incumbent on us to teach history to young people, to remember the history to young people, and set the stage for the challenges that the Jewish people will face in Israel and all around the world.
Well, you've stood against the forces of hatred in lots of different ways. I'm reminded of the time that former Congressman, the late Congressman John Lewis, invited you to co-lead the annual walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And you joined him with that to stand against the hatred of racism. So it's about the call, isn't it, to oppose hatred, to oppose forces of hatred, right, and to affirm the importance of loving thy neighbor. And we've run out of time, so I'm just going to say thank you very much for all that you're doing in this regard, for coming here today and squeezing us into a busy day, for joining us in the future here at our new center together, and for all your leadership in this country. We thank you greatly, and God bless you very much. Let's thank the Vice President.
Thank you all. God bless you.